The brass handles of the double mahogany doors feel like ice beneath my trembling palms as I press my full weight against them. And the moment they swing open with a dramatic crash that echoes through what I can only assume is the most expensive casino office in the entire state of Nevada, I realize there is absolutely no turning back from the path I have chosen tonight. The Crimson Rose Casino pulses with life 3 floors below me, its heartbeat of slot machines and desperate gamblers thrumming through the thick carpets and up into this sanctuary of power, where men who control the darkness of this city make decisions that alter lives with the casual flick of a cigarette ash. But up here in this temple of expensive leather and imported wood, there is only silence, and the sudden, sharp sound of chairs scraping back as 4 massive men in tailored suits reach for weapons. I can only imagine are tucked against their ribs in holsters that cost more than my entire wardrobe. I am 17 years old. I am wearing my dead mother's coat because it still smells like her perfume, and I cannot bear to let that scent fade into nothing. And I am about to confront the most dangerous man in the Russian Mafia about whether or not he is the father who abandoned me before I ever drew my first breath into this cruel and unforgiving world. Put your guns away. A voice cuts through the tension like a blade through silk, and it comes from the man seated behind the massive desk that dominates the far end of this cavernous office. A man who has not moved a single muscle since I burst through his doors like some kind of avenging angel dressed in thrift store jeans and fury that has been building in my chest for 3 weeks straight. If she wanted me dead, I'd already be dead. And besides, look at her. She's practically shaking hard enough to shatter into 1,000 pieces right here on my Persian rug. Dominic Volkov does not look like a monster, which is perhaps the most terrifying thing about him, as I force my legs to carry me across the expanse of blood-red carpet that separates his throne from the doors I have just violated with my desperate entrance. He looks like someone's sophisticated uncle, the kind of man who would drink expensive scotch at charity galas and write checks to children's hospitals while discussing market trends and vacation homes in the Mediterranean, with his salt and pepper hair swept back from a face that might have been carved from marble by an artist who understood that true power does not need to advertise itself with scars and sneers. But it is his eyes that stop my heart mid-beat. Those peculiar steel-gray eyes that hold flecks of something lighter, something almost silver in the low amber lighting of his office, and more importantly, that distinctive violet ring around each iris that I have only ever seen in one other place in my entire life, staring back at me from my own reflection in the mirror every single morning. My mother's death certificate crinkles in my grip, the official document that declares Sophia Marino died in a single-car collision on Highway 95 3 weeks ago. Though the detective with the kind eyes and the wedding ring that he twisted nervously while he delivered the news could not quite meet my gaze when he called it an accident. And I knew even then, in that sterile hospital waiting room that smelled of antiseptic and broken dreams, that there was something he was not telling me. The second document, my birth certificate with its damning blank space where a father's name should be inscribed in permanent ink, feels like it weighs 1,000 pounds as I pull it from the inner pocket of my mother's coat and prepare to lay my entire desperate hand on the table in front of this man who might hold every answer to every question that has haunted me since I was old enough to wonder why I never had a daddy to teach me how to ride a bike or scare away the boys who pulled my hair in elementary school. My mother died 3 weeks ago, I say, and my voice sounds stronger than I expected it to. Carries across the space between us without wavering, even though my knees feel like they might give out at any moment and send me crashing to the floor in an undignified heap of grief and terror. She waited until she could barely breathe, until the machines were the only things keeping her lungs moving air in and out of her broken body. And then she grabbed my hand so tight I thought she might break my fingers, and she told me to find Dominic Volkov because he was the only one who could protect me now. Something flickers across his face, something that might be pain or might be memory, or might be the ghost of a love story I know nothing about. But it vanishes so quickly I almost convince myself I imagined it as he leans back in his chair, that probably costs more than a semester of the community college I was supposed to start next fall, before my entire world imploded into chaos and questions. He does not tell me to leave, does not call his guards to throw me out onto the street where I probably belong, and instead he reaches for the crystal decanter on his desk and pours himself 2 fingers of amber liquid that catches the light like captured sunshine before he brings it to his lips, and takes a slow, deliberate sip that makes me wait in agonizing silence for whatever words will come next from his mouth. Sophia. He says her name like a prayer, like a curse, like something precious that he has not allowed himself to speak aloud in so many years that it hurts his throat to shape the syllables. Sophia Marino was the most beautiful woman I have ever seen in my entire life, and I have lived a very long life filled with beautiful women who threw themselves at my feet, hoping to catch the attention of a man with power and money and connections that could change their destinies with a single phone call. I slam my birth certificate down on his desk with more force than I intended, and the sharp crack of paper hitting wood makes one of the guards shift his weight nervously. But Dominic's eyes never leave mine as I lean forward and let every ounce of desperate fury pour out of me in words that taste like ashes and tears. Are you my father? The question hangs between us like smoke from the cigarette smoldering in the ashtray at his elbow, and I watch his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Watch the way his fingers grip his glass just a fraction harder. And I know with absolute certainty that whatever he says next is going to change everything about who I thought I was, and who I might become in the wreckage of this revelation. The silence stretches for what feels like a lifetime, and in that suspended moment I catalog every detail of this man who might be my father. The way his expensive suit fits him like it was sewn directly onto his body by tailors who understand that clothing is armor for men who live in constant danger. The heavy signet ring on his right hand that bears some kind of crest I do not recognize. The faint scar that runs along his left temple and disappears into his hairline like a reminder of some violence he survived when other men would have died. He sets down his glass with careful precision, and when he finally speaks, his voice carries the weight of every regret and every loss and every sacrifice he has made in whatever dark journey brought him to this moment of confession with a teenage girl who burst into his life demanding answers to questions she might not actually want answered. Your mother was the love of my life, he says, and each word lands like a physical blow against my chest, stealing the air from my lungs as I realize that this man sitting before me loved my mother in a way that left scars on his soul that probably still bleed when he is alone in the dark hours before dawn. I would have burned down the entire world for Sophia Marino, would have walked away from everything I built, and everyone who depended on me if she had asked me to, would have become a different man entirely if she had believed that I was capable of that kind of transformation from the monster I was into the man she deserved. Hope blooms in my chest like a poisonous flower, and I can already feel the tears building behind my eyes as I prepare myself for the moment when he confirms what I have suspected, since I first saw those violet rings in his eyes that match my own. But then his expression shifts into something harder, something that looks almost like pity mixed with a resignation that makes my stomach drop like I have just stepped off a cliff into empty air. But you are not mine, he continues, and those 5 words detonate like a bomb in the center of my chest, obliterating the fragile hope I had constructed from coincidence and desperate wishes. You are not mine, Celeste, and I wish to God that you were, because then at least some part of Sophia would still be walking around in this world, would still be breathing and laughing and carrying forward the best parts of the woman who haunts every decision I make, and every quiet moment when I allow myself to remember what it felt like to believe in something beyond power and control. The room spins around me, and I grip the edge of his desk to keep myself upright as he opens a drawer and pulls out a photograph that looks like it has been handled so many times the edges are soft with wear. And when he slides it across the polished wood toward me with hands that I notice are shaking slightly, I see my mother's face staring back at me from what must be 17 or 18 years ago. She looks impossibly young, impossibly radiant, wearing a red dress that clings to her curves and smiling up at a man whose face makes my blood run cold, even though I have never seen him before in my entire life. You are his, Dominic says, and the way he speaks that simple pronoun makes it sound like a death sentence. Your mother was caught between two empires 17 years ago, caught between me and Victor Constantine, the man who has been my enemy since we were boys growing up in the same brutal streets of Moscow, learning the same lessons about violence and loyalty and how to survive in a world that eats weak men alive and spits out their bones. I pick up the photograph with nerveless fingers, and I stare at the man holding my mother in the image, Victor Constantine, tall and distinguished with dark hair shot through with silver even then, wearing an expression of such possessive intensity as he looks at my mother that it makes my skin crawl with instinctive revulsion. But it is his eyes that confirm everything Dominic is telling me. Those distinctive steel-gray eyes with the unmistakable violet rings that mark him as my biological father, in a way that cannot be denied or explained away or wished into a different truth. Victor obsessed over her, Dominic continues, and his voice has gone lower, darker, carrying undercurrents of old rage and older pain that still pulse just beneath his controlled surface. I loved Sophia, but Victor claimed her, possessed her, took her during one violent night when I was presumed dead after an ambush that should have killed me but instead only made me stronger and more determined to return to her and reclaim what was mine. My mouth has gone completely dry, and when I try to speak, nothing comes out except a sound that might be a sob, or might be the last gasp of the girl I was, before I walked through those mahogany doors and learned that my father is not the man I hoped he might be, but instead is someone whose very name makes Dominic Volkov's expression twist with such hatred that I can feel it radiating off him in waves that make the air between us crackle with tension. By the time I survived and returned to find her, your mother was pregnant and had vanished into witness protection, had disappeared so completely that I spent years searching every city and every town and every forgotten corner of this country trying to find even a trace of her, he says. And now he stands up from his chair and walks around the desk to stand directly in front of me, close enough that I can smell his cologne and see the fine lines around his eyes that speak of too many sleepless nights and too many impossible choices. Victor never knew about you, never knew that night resulted in the child he has always wanted, an heir to carry on his name and his empire and his particular brand of cruelty that makes what I do look like child's play in comparison. The photograph slips from my fingers and flutters to the carpet, but I cannot look away from Dominic's face as he reaches out and gently, so gently it breaks something inside me, tilts my chin up so I have no choice but to meet his eyes that are not my father's eyes, but are the eyes of the man my mother loved enough to run from both of them in the desperate hope of protecting the baby growing inside her from the violence that defined their world. Until now, he says, and those two words carry such weight that I know without him explaining further that something has changed, some protection has failed, some secret has been exposed in a way that has put me directly in the crosshairs of forces I do not understand. Your mother's car accident 3 weeks ago was no accident, Celeste, and I need you to understand what that means. Victor discovered her location, discovered you exist, and now he wants his heir, wants to mold you into his successor, and he will burn down everything I have built, will destroy every person I care about, and reduce this entire city to ashes if that is what it takes to get his hands on you. Terror floods through my veins like ice water, but beneath it, I feel something else rising up. A furious determination to understand why my mother spent 17 years running, why she died without ever telling me the truth about who I really am, and why this man standing in front of me looks at me with such complicated grief etched into every line of his distinguished face. Dominic takes a deep breath, and when he speaks again, his voice carries the weight of a promise that I know he means with every fiber of his dangerous being. I will protect you because I loved her more than I have ever loved anyone or anything in my entire brutal existence, he says, and each word feels like a vow sealed in blood and fire. But you need to understand something critical before you decide whether or not to trust me with your life. Your real father is a monster I have been trying to kill for 20 years, and now that he knows you exist, he will stop at absolutely nothing to claim you as his own. The guest suite in Dominic's penthouse apartment above the casino feels more like a 5-star hotel room than a safe house, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering madness of the Las Vegas Strip, and its bathroom that is larger than the entire apartment my mother and I shared in. Our quiet neighborhood where nobody asked questions and everyone kept to themselves. But despite the Egyptian cotton sheets and the minibar stocked with expensive water and the kind of toiletries that come in heavy glass bottles instead of plastic, I cannot sleep because every time I close my eyes I see that photograph of my mother in the arms of a man whose blood runs through my veins like a contamination I can never wash away. Dawn breaks over the desert in shades of pink and gold that would be beautiful if I had any capacity left to appreciate beauty after spending the entire night pacing the perimeter of this luxurious cage while my mind races through every memory of my childhood, searching for clues I missed, for signs that my mother was running from something more dangerous than poverty or bad luck, or the vague mistakes in her past she referenced whenever I pushed too hard for information about my father. The knock on my door comes at exactly 7 in the morning, and when I open it expecting one of Dominic's silent guards with their dead eyes and their barely concealed weapons, I am surprised to find the man himself, standing in the hallway wearing dark slacks and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, holding 2 cups of coffee that smell like they came from somewhere much better than the standard hotel pot, and looking at me with an expression that suggests he did not sleep any better than I did during the long hours of darkness. "We need to talk," he says, and there is something in his voice that makes it clear this is not a request, but rather a necessary conversation that I can either have willingly or be forced into through circumstances that will be much less pleasant. So I step aside and let him enter my temporary sanctuary, with its unmade bed and its windows I never bothered to cover because somehow watching the city lights felt less lonely than sitting in total darkness, with only my spiraling thoughts for company. He hands me one of the coffee cups and settles himself in the chair by the window, with the practiced ease of a man who has had thousands of difficult conversations in thousands of different locations. And I realize with a strange sort of clarity that this is what my mother must have loved about him. This absolute confidence, this unshakable presence that suggests he could handle any crisis or catastrophe without ever losing his composure or his control over the situation. "I'm going to tell you everything," he begins, and the way he says it makes it sound like a confession, like something he has been carrying for 17 years and is finally ready to set down, even though the weight of these truths will now be transferred to my shoulders, whether I am strong enough to bear them or not. "Your mother, Sophia, came into my life when I was 32 years old, and already so deep in this world of blood and money that I had convinced myself I was incapable of feeling anything beyond the cold calculation of profit and loss, threat and opportunity, loyalty and betrayal that defines every relationship in the organization I built from the ground up after my father was murdered in a power play I was too young and too weak to prevent. The coffee is perfect, rich and strong with just enough cream to soften the bitterness, and I wrap both hands around the cup, seeking warmth, even though the temperature in the room is perfectly comfortable, because there is a chill spreading through my core that has nothing to do with the physical environment and everything to do with the story. I can sense building in Dominic's words like a storm gathering on the horizon. He stares out the window at the city below, and I wonder if he is seeing the present or if his mind has traveled back nearly 2 decades to a time when my mother was alive and beautiful, and somehow caught between 2 powerful men who both wanted to own her in ways that probably had very little to do with actual love, and everything to do with possession and pride, and the eternal competition between rivals who measure their worth by what they can take from each other. She was working as a translator at a gallery opening, hired for the evening because she spoke fluent Russian and Italian in addition to English, and she wore this blue dress that matched her eyes and made every man in the room forget whatever business they had come to conduct because they were too busy trying to catch her attention or make her smile. He continues, and there is such tenderness in his voice when he speaks of her that it makes my chest ache with grief for the mother I lost and the love story that apparently ended in such tragedy that she spent the rest of her life hiding from its consequences. I approached her because I needed her to translate a conversation I was having with an Italian supplier. But the moment she looked at me with those intelligent eyes that saw straight through all the expensive suits and dangerous reputation to the man underneath, I was finished. Completely and utterly lost in a way I had never experienced before and have never experienced since. As if Sophia reached inside my chest and rearranged everything that made me who I was and left me fundamentally altered by nothing more than her presence. I sink down onto the edge of the bed because my legs no longer feel capable of supporting my weight, and I realize with a strange sort of wonder that this is the most honest conversation I have ever had with anyone about my mother, who kept her past locked away so tightly that I grew up believing she had no history before I was born, as if she materialized into existence fully formed as my mother and nothing more. Dominic seems to sense my need to hear everything, and he shifts in his chair so he is facing me fully, giving me his complete attention in a way that makes me understand why men follow him and enemies fear him. Because when Dominic Volkov looks at you, it feels like you are the only person in the entire world who matters in that particular moment. Victor Constantine was at that same gallery opening because of course he was. We have been circling each other like predators competing for territory since we were 15 years old, and both trying to survive in the same brutal hierarchy of the Russian underworld in Moscow, he says. And now his expression hardens into something cold and dangerous that reminds me exactly what kind of man is sitting in my room drinking coffee and telling me bedtime stories about my origins. Victor saw me with Sophia, saw the way I looked at her like a man who has just discovered religion after a lifetime of atheism, and he decided in that moment that he wanted her for no other reason than because I wanted her, because taking something I valued was more important to him than any genuine feeling he might have developed on his own. The rivalry between them suddenly makes terrible sense. The kind of sense that explains why my mother might have felt trapped between two forces that cared more about winning against each other than about her actual happiness, or safety, or right to choose her own destiny without being treated like a prize in some eternal competition. I take a sip of my coffee and try to imagine my mother navigating this dangerous game. Try to picture her young and alive and caught in the crossfire of male egos and mafia politics that probably seemed exciting right up until the moment she realized how much blood would be spilled in her name. She chose me, Dominic says, and there is such quiet triumph in those 3 words that I understand this is the victory that has sustained him through nearly 2 decades of loss and regret. Despite Victor's wealth and his charm and his relentless pursuit, Sophia chose me, and for 8 months I experienced something I had never believed possible, a relationship built on more than fear or obligation. Mornings waking up next to someone who saw the worst parts of me and somehow still found reasons to stay. Conversations that lasted until sunrise about everything and nothing, a future I could actually imagine beyond the next deal, or the next territorial dispute, or the next assassination attempt from rivals who wanted what I had built. But of course there is a but coming. Because if this story had a happy ending, I would not be sitting here 17 years later drinking coffee with a man who is not my father, while my real father apparently hunts me through the city like prey. And I brace myself for whatever terrible turn this narrative is about to take as Dominic's expression shifts from nostalgia into something much darker and more complicated. He stands up and walks to the window, pressing one hand against the glass, as if he needs the physical sensation to ground himself in the present moment. Instead of being pulled completely into the past, he is excavating for my benefit. Victor did not accept Sophia's choice with any kind of grace or dignity, he continues, and his voice has gone flat in the way people's voices do when they are discussing trauma. They have worked very hard to compartmentalize and control. He escalated his pursuit into harassment, showing up at her apartment, sending gifts she did not want, making threats disguised as romantic gestures about how she belonged to him. And I had simply poisoned her mind against her true destiny. And I should have killed him then. Should have put a bullet in his head and dealt with the territorial war that would have resulted. But Sophia begged me not to. begged me to let it go because she was terrified of the violence and what it would turn me into if I crossed that particular line for her. I can hear the regret in every syllable, the weight of a decision made for love that resulted in catastrophe. And I wonder if this is what my mother carried with her all those years. The knowledge that her desire to avoid bloodshed ultimately led to something far worse than a clean execution would have produced. Dominic turns back to face me, and in the morning light streaming through the window, I can see every year of his age and every burden of his choices etched into his face like a map of suffering. "There was an ambush," he says, and these words come slowly, as if each one costs him something to speak aloud. "A coordinated attack on a warehouse where I was meeting with suppliers from Moscow. 12 men with automatic weapons and clear orders to make sure I did not walk out alive. And in the chaos and the gunfire and the desperate scramble for survival, I took 3 bullets, one through my shoulder, one through my side, and one that grazed my skull and left me unconscious in a pool of my own blood, while my enemies assumed they had finally managed to eliminate the obstacle that stood between Victor Constantine and whatever he wanted to take from the kingdom I had built. My coffee has gone cold in my hands, but I cannot look away from Dominic as he describes what must have been my mother's worst nightmare coming to life. The violence she tried so hard to prevent catching up with them anyway, because that is apparently what happens when you love men who live in worlds where death is always waiting around the next corner. He walks back to his chair and sits down heavily, suddenly looking every one of his years in a way he did not when he first entered my room. I was in a coma for 6 days, and when I finally woke up in a private hospital with my second-in-command keeping vigil at my bedside, the first thing I asked about was Sophia, and the look on Alessandro's face told me everything I needed to know before he said a single word. Dominic continues, and I can see the old pain flickering behind his eyes like a wound that never properly healed. Victor had gone to her the night of the ambush, had told her I was dead, had found her vulnerable and grieving and terrified, and in her devastated state he had taken advantage of her despair in a way that I cannot describe, without wanting to resurrect him just so I can kill him all over again with my bare hands, and much more slowly than any bullet would allow. The implication of what he is saying crashes over me like a wave of ice water, and suddenly I understand exactly how I came to exist, not through love or even mutual desire, but through my mother's grief being exploited by a man who saw her broken heart as an opportunity to claim what he had always believed should be his. My stomach turns with nausea, and I set down my coffee cup before I drop it because my hands have started shaking so badly I can no longer maintain my grip on anything solid or real. By the time I recovered enough to leave the hospital and search for her, Sophia had vanished completely, Dominic says, and his voice has gone hoarse with emotion he is struggling to contain. She left no forwarding address, no note, no trace of where she might have gone or how I could find her. And it was not until months later that I learned through my contacts she had entered witness protection, had claimed her life was in danger from organized crime connections, and had been relocated somewhere in the vast expanse of America under a new identity that even my considerable resources could not penetrate. I think about my childhood, about the way my mother never stayed in one place for more than a few years, about how we moved from Oregon to Nevada to California and back to Nevada, about how she always paid rent in cash and never had credit cards or social media or any kind of digital footprint that could be traced. And suddenly all those quirks that I attributed to her being overly cautious or just eccentric make perfect sense as the survival strategies of a woman trying to stay hidden from forces that would destroy her if they ever found her location. Victor never knew you existed, Dominic continues, and now he leans forward with his elbows on his knees, his entire posture radiating a tension that makes the air in the room feel thick and dangerous. Sophia managed to hide her pregnancy from everyone, managed to disappear so completely that even Victor's considerable network could not find a trace of her. And for 17 years you were safe because you were a secret. Because the witness protection program did its job and kept you both hidden from the world that wanted to reclaim her, and would have wanted to claim you as well if they had known you existed. But something changed, and I can see it coming in the way. Dominic's expression shifts from regret into something harder and more immediate, something that explains why my mother died 3 weeks ago, and why I am now sitting in a penthouse safe house learning about the father I never knew I had, and probably wish I could continue not knowing about for the rest of my life. He reaches into his pocket and pulls out his phone, and when he turns the screen toward me, I see a photograph that makes my blood run cold. Myself, walking across my high school parking lot just 2 months ago, completely unaware that someone was watching me and documenting my existence. Someone found her, Dominic says, and the simplicity of that statement cannot hide the terrible implications behind it. Someone in Victor's organization, or perhaps Victor himself, discovered Sophia's location, discovered that she had a 17-year-old daughter with distinctive violet-ringed eyes that could only have come from one possible source, and they arranged her accident to eliminate the obstacle that stood between Victor and his newfound heir, while making it look random enough that you would not immediately go into hiding. The room spins around me, and I grip the edge of the mattress so hard my knuckles turn white because I need something solid to hold on to, while my entire understanding of my mother's death reconstructs itself from tragic accident into calculated murder designed to isolate me and make me vulnerable to a man who apparently wants to claim me as his daughter, not because he loves me, but because I represent his legacy and his victory over the man my mother actually chose. Dominic stands up and crosses the space between us, and when he kneels down in front of me so we are at eye level, I can see genuine concern mixed with the strategic calculation of a man who is already planning his next moves in a war I did not know I was part of until approximately 12 hours ago. Victor has been making inquiries, sending people to ask questions around your neighborhood, trying to find out where you went after your mother's death, and whether you have any other family he needs to account for in his plans to acquire you, he says, and each word lands like a physical blow against my already bruised sense of reality. He wants you, Celeste, not as a daughter, but as a symbol, the child he never got to raise, the heir he always wanted, the final proof that he won against me even if it took 17 years for his victory to manifest, and most importantly, the living connection to the woman who chose me over him, and therefore must be reclaimed and controlled to soothe his damaged ego. I am drowning in information, gasping for air in a room that suddenly feels too small and too confined despite its generous proportions, and when I finally find my voice, it comes out raw and desperate with all the fear I have been trying to suppress since I burst into Dominic's office last night. What does he want with me, specifically? I ask, and I am not sure I actually want to know the answer, but I also cannot make any decisions about my future without understanding exactly what kind of danger I am facing, and what my biological father's intentions might be beyond the vague threat of being claimed like property or territory. Dominic's expression becomes impossibly grave, and he reaches out to take both of my hands in his much larger ones, and the gesture is so unexpectedly paternal that it makes tears spring to my eyes because this is the man who should have been my father. This is the man my mother loved, and yet I am stuck with the DNA of a monster who apparently sees me as nothing more than a trophy to be won, and a tool to be used in whatever schemes define his criminal empire. Victor wants to mold you into his successor, wants to train you in the family business and eventually marry you off to someone in his organization to create alliances and produce the grandchildren who will carry on the Constantine name into the next generation, he says. And every word is like a nail being driven into the coffin of my normal teenage life, where my biggest concerns were supposed to be college applications and prom dates, and whether I could afford a car before graduation. You are not a daughter to him, Celeste. You are a dynasty. You are revenge. You are his proof that he can take and keep and control anything he wants regardless of how long he has to wait, or who he has to kill to get it. And he will burn down everything in his path to make sure you end up exactly where he wants you to be. 3 days of living in Dominic's fortress estate feel like 3 years, and I find myself suffocating under the weight of constant surveillance and luxury that cannot mask the prison-like reality of my situation, where every door I approach is guarded by silent men, with weapons bulging under their designer suits, and every window overlooks manicured grounds, patrolled by more guards who probably have orders to shoot first and ask questions later if anyone tries to breach the perimeter that separates me from the world I used to know before my mother died and took all my illusions of normalcy with her to the grave. The estate itself is a sprawling Mediterranean-style compound in the hills overlooking the city, complete with marble fountains and imported olive trees, and a pool that glitters like a sapphire under the relentless Nevada sun. But despite all this carefully cultivated beauty, I feel like a bird in a gilded cage, beautiful and trapped, and slowly losing my mind from the combination of boredom and terror that defines every waking moment of this strange liminal existence between my old life and whatever nightmare future is barreling toward me with the inevitability of a freight train. Alessandro De Luca, Dominic's second-in-command, has become my constant shadow. A man of perhaps 40, with dark hair starting to silver at the temples, and eyes that are so dark they look almost black in certain lighting, who speaks rarely, but watches everything with the intensity of someone who has survived in this dangerous world by never missing a single detail or letting his guard down for even a fraction of a second. He is beautiful in the way dangerous things are beautiful, all sharp angles and controlled violence wrapped in expensive clothing and an aura of barely restrained lethality that makes me acutely aware that this man could kill me with his bare hands in approximately 30 seconds if Dominic gave the order. And yet there is something almost gentle in the way he maintains his vigil over me, always staying exactly 10 feet away unless he senses some threat that requires him to close the distance, never speaking unless I speak first, and occasionally bringing me things without being asked, like books from Dominic's library or the specific brand of tea I mentioned liking during one of our stilted conversations. But gentleness and surveillance are not companionship, and by the third afternoon I am crawling out of my skin with the need to understand more about the man whose blood I carry. The biological father who is apparently hunting me through the city, with resources and determination that have forced me into hiding like a fugitive who committed the crime of being born to the wrong parents in the wrong circumstances. Dominic has given me access to the estate's impressive library and media room and gym, and practically everything except the private office where he conducts his business, and the security center where I assume his men monitor the cameras and communication systems that keep this fortress functioning as both home and headquarters. But what I really need is information about Victor Constantine that goes beyond Dominic's biased characterization of him as a monster and a rival, because I have learned through 17 years of surviving on instinct that the truth usually lives somewhere between the extremes of how opposing sides describe each other. The decision to hack into Dominic's private files comes to me during a sleepless night, when Alessandro is standing watch outside my bedroom door and the house has gone quiet, except for the ambient sounds of expensive security systems humming their electronic lullabies, and I realize with sudden clarity that my mother's old laptop, the one the police returned to me along with her other personal effects after the investigation into her death, concluded with the official ruling of accidental death that makes my blood boil every time I think about it, is still in my backpack and contains all her passwords meticulously recorded in a little notebook she kept hidden in a zippered pocket, because she never trusted her memory with important information. My mother worked in technology before I was born, did something with computer programming and systems analysis that she never talked about in detail, but that left her with skills she occasionally used for freelance work when money got tight. And as I boot up her laptop in the darkness of my luxurious prison, I send up a silent prayer to her ghost that she has left me the tools I need to find the truth about the man she spent 17 years running from. It takes me 3 hours of careful work, moving slowly and methodically through the estate's wireless network, which is surprisingly sophisticated but not sophisticated enough to stop someone who learned programming basics from a mother who believed every woman should know how to navigate technology without depending on men to explain it to her. And when I finally breach the firewall protecting Dominic's personal server, I feel a surge of triumph mixed with guilt, because I am betraying the trust of the man who is currently keeping me alive, even though he has no biological obligation to do so. The files I find are extensive. Decades worth of information organized with the meticulous attention to detail I would expect from someone who has survived in organized crime through superior intelligence gathering and strategic planning. And I navigate through folders labeled with names and dates and operations until I find the one marked simply VK and know with absolute certainty that I have found what I am looking for. The photographs appear first, dozens of them spanning what looks like 30 years or more, and I find myself staring at images of Victor Constantine at various ages and in various contexts. Young and dangerous-looking and grainy photos from what must be Moscow in the 90s, mature and distinguished in more recent pictures from charity events and business conferences. And always with those distinctive steel-gray eyes, with violet rings that mark him unmistakably as my biological father, in a way that makes my stomach twist with complicated emotions I cannot begin to untangle. He is handsome in a way that is almost painful to look at, the kind of masculine beauty that probably makes people trust him right up until the moment he destroys them, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw, and silver-streaked dark hair, swept back from a face that could belong to a CEO, or a diplomat, or a professor, rather than a crime lord who apparently specializes in violence sophisticated enough that Dominic considers him more dangerous than any other rival in their shared deadly world. But it is the subfolder labeled Sophia that makes my hands shake as I click it open. And suddenly I am looking at my mother through the eyes of a man who documented her existence with obsessive thoroughness that borders on stalking, except I suspect it crossed that border so completely that border is no longer even visible in the rearview mirror. There are hundreds of photos. Sophia at the gallery where they met. Sophia walking down streets apparently unaware she was being photographed. Sophia laughing with friends at a restaurant. Sophia leaving the apartment she must have shared with Dominic. And interspersed among these surveillance images are more intimate shots that suggest my mother at some point agreed to be photographed intentionally. Pictures where she is looking directly at the camera, with expressions ranging from cautious interest to something that might be fear, or might be the beginning of the realization that this man's attention was not the flattering pursuit she might have initially believed it to be. The letters appear in another folder, and when I open the first one I immediately wish I had not, because the words on the screen are so intensely personal and so deeply disturbing that I can feel my skin crawling with second-hand violation on behalf of the mother who had to receive these messages and live with the knowledge that someone was thinking about her in ways that had nothing to do with healthy affection and everything to do with pathological possession. My darling Sophia, the first letter begins, dated approximately 6 months before I was born. You cannot continue hiding from destiny by pretending that your feelings for Dominic Volkov are anything more than a temporary confusion brought on by his superficial charm and his ability to make you feel protected from the world that frightens you so terribly. You belong to me in ways that transcend your current understanding. Belong to me because I saw you first and claimed you first, and loved you with an intensity that Dominic's shallow affections cannot possibly match. And when you finally accept this fundamental truth about our connection, you will understand that everything I have done has been for your own good, for our future together, for the family we will build once you stop running from the inevitable conclusion of this story we are writing together, whether you choose to acknowledge it or not. I scroll through letter after letter, each one more unhinged than the last, watching Victor's language devolve from romantic obsession into something much darker and more possessive as the months progress, and my mother's disappearance becomes permanent in his mind. You are carrying my legacy, Sophia, he writes in a letter dated 3 weeks after I was born, though he clearly did not know this at the time he wrote it. You cannot hide her from me forever, cannot keep my child away from me and expect that I will simply accept this theft of what rightfully belongs to me. And when I find you, and I will find you, darling, I will always find you because you are mine and nothing in this world can change that essential truth. When I find you, I will forgive everything, because love means forgiving even the deepest betrayals when they come from the person who holds your heart in her beautiful hands. The realization hits me like a physical blow. Victor knew, somehow knew, or at least strongly suspected, that my mother was pregnant when she disappeared. And he has spent 17 years searching for us with the patience of someone who believes time is irrelevant when you are pursuing something you consider your rightful property. I scroll faster through the files, desperately seeking anything that might tell me who this man really is beyond Dominic's characterization and Victor's own disturbing self-revelations. And I find financial records that show legitimate business holdings in real estate and shipping alongside clearly illegal operations in weapons trafficking and money laundering, personnel files on people who work for him with notations that make it clear he inspires loyalty through a combination of generous rewards and terrifying punishments, and incident reports documenting violence that makes my stomach turn, even though the clinical language tries to sanitize the brutality of men who had their fingers removed for minor infractions, or rivals who simply disappeared after crossing him in business negotiations. A new email notification pops up on my mother's laptop, and my heart nearly stops. When I see it is not going to her old email account, but rather has somehow been routed to me through a process I do not understand, until I read the message and realize with dawning horror that Victor has found a way to contact me directly, has somehow traced my digital footprint through my mother's laptop, or perhaps has been waiting for me to do exactly what I just did and connect to a network that would give him the opening he needed to reach out and make contact with the daughter he has never met, but clearly believes belongs to him. Celeste, the email begins, and seeing my name written by a stranger who shares my DNA makes something cold settle in my chest. I know you are reading this in Dominic Volkov's estate. Know you are surrounded by his men and his weapons and his assurances that he can keep you safe from me. But I need you to understand something fundamental about the situation you find yourself in, through no fault of your own. Dominic is lying to you about who I am and what I want. Lying because the truth would undermine his position as your protector and force you to question whether the man who has taken you into his home is really acting in your best interests, or is simply using you as another pawn in the endless game we have been playing since we were boys fighting for survival in streets that taught us cruelty, long before they taught us anything resembling compassion or mercy. The email continues for several more paragraphs, and I read every word with a mixture of fascination and revulsion, because Victor's voice comes through the text as educated and sophisticated and almost reasonable. Nothing like the monster Dominic described or the obsessive stalker revealed in those disturbing letters to my mother. And I find myself wondering if this is the real Victor, or if this is simply another mask he wears when he wants to manipulate someone into believing he is something other than what he actually is. I have maintained a room for you in my home for 17 years, Celeste. A space waiting for the daughter I always knew existed, even when I had no proof beyond the absolute certainty in my heart that Sophia would not have run so completely unless she was protecting something infinitely precious from the violence she believed defined my world. I have kept your mother's jewelry, every piece she left behind in her desperate flight, and I have photographs of you from various stages of your childhood that my people managed to acquire over the years. Nothing invasive or inappropriate, simply the usual school pictures and candid shots that any father would treasure if he were allowed to be part of his daughter's life instead of being painted as a villain by the man who drove your mother away with his own capacity for violence and destruction. My hands are shaking so badly I can barely control the laptop, and when the email continues with an invitation, I know I should ignore but cannot stop reading. I feel something fundamental shifting in my understanding of the situation I have found myself trapped within. Come to me willingly, Celeste, and I will tell you the complete truth about the night your mother ran. Will tell you about the fire Dominic set in his jealous rage, and how your mother barely escaped with her life, and the life of the child growing inside her. Will show you evidence that Dominic has kept hidden, because it reveals him to be just as dangerous and just as monstrous as he claims I am. Except unlike me, he has never owned his darkness, or admitted that his love for your mother was just as possessive and destructive as mine, merely better disguised behind a facade of respectability and control. Ask him about the night of the fire, Celeste. Ask him what he did in his attempt to eliminate me once and for all. And watch his face carefully when he tries to justify attempted murder as somehow different or more acceptable than the crimes he attributes to me with such self-righteous condemnation. The email ends with an address in a part of the city I do not know, and a promise that his door will be open to me whenever I choose to walk through it, and hear his side of a story that apparently has more complexity than Dominic has been willing to share. And I sit in the darkness of my bedroom staring at the screen until my eyes burn, and my head pounds with the pressure of too much information crashing against the fragile foundations of what I thought I understood about my situation. The knock on my door makes me jump so violently I nearly drop the laptop, and when Alessandro's voice comes through the wood asking if everything is all right, because he heard movement and wants to make sure I am not in distress, I force myself to close all the files and clear the browser history and respond in a voice that sounds almost normal that I am fine, just could not sleep, and was reading something on my computer to pass the time until exhaustion finally claims me. But I am not fine, not even close to fine, because Victor's words have planted seeds of doubt that are already taking root in the fertile ground of my desperate need to understand the complete truth, rather than the carefully curated version Dominic has presented. And when I finally turn off the laptop and lie back down in my bed, with its expensive sheets and its view of grounds patrolled by armed guards, I know with absolute certainty that I am going to have to confront Dominic about the fire and about what really happened 17 years ago that was so terrible my mother chose to vanish completely, rather than stay and try to build a life with either of the men who claimed to love her. Sleep refuses to come despite my exhaustion, and I watch the sky slowly lighten through my window while my mind races through possibilities and implications, and the terrible realization that nothing in this situation is as simple as good versus evil or protector versus predator, but rather I am caught between two men who are both capable of tremendous violence and both convinced they have my best interests at heart, even as they use me as a weapon against each other in a war that began before I was born and will apparently continue until one of them is dead, or I make a choice that will define the rest of my life in ways I cannot begin to predict or control. The confrontation with Dominic happens at breakfast 3 days after Victor's email arrived, like a digital bomb designed to detonate my trust in the man who has been sheltering me, and I walk into the sunlit dining room where Dominic sits reading the morning paper with his coffee and his perfectly composed expression, and I throw my mother's laptop onto the table hard enough that his cup rattles in its saucer, and declare in a voice shaking with fury and betrayal that I know about the fire, know about what he did 17 years ago, and I need him to tell me the complete truth right now, or I will walk out of this estate and take my chances with Victor because at least he has been honest about being a monster instead of pretending to be my savior while hiding his own capacity for the kind of violence that drove my mother into a life of perpetual flight. Dominic's face goes very still in that way. Dangerous men's faces do when they are calculating how much truth they can afford to reveal without completely destroying the fragile alliance they have built. And he carefully folds his newspaper and sets it aside before gesturing for Alessandro to leave us alone. And the fact that he dismisses his most trusted lieutenant tells me he understands this conversation is going to go places he does not want witnesses, for no matter how loyal those witnesses might be to him personally. Yes, there was a fire at Victor's estate 17 years ago, he begins, and the admission comes out flat and emotionless in the way confessions do when someone has rehearsed them in their mind countless times, but never expected to actually have to speak them aloud. Yes, I said it, planned it meticulously, with the specific intention of eliminating Victor Constantine, once and for all, because I had reached a point where I understood that as long as he was alive he would never stop pursuing Sophia, would never accept that she had chosen me, and would eventually escalate his obsession into violence that would destroy her, and destroy me, and destroy any chance we had of building something that resembled a normal life together, despite the world we both inhabited. The casual way he admits to attempted murder makes my blood run cold, and I grip the edge of the table to steady myself as he continues with his confession that sounds more like a tactical debriefing than an acknowledgement of moral failure. I knew Victor would be at his estate that night, because I had people on his security staff who fed me information about his schedule and his routines, knew that he kept minimal guards on the property because he believed his reputation was protection enough. And I chose fire specifically because it would look like an accident. Faulty wiring in an old building, tragic but not immediately suspicious in a way that a more direct assassination would have been. But there is more coming. I can see it building in the tension around his eyes, and the way his hands have curled into fists on the table. And when he continues speaking, his voice has dropped into a register I have never heard from him before. Something raw and desperate that suggests the memory of what happened next still has the power to hurt him in ways he has spent nearly 2 decades trying to insulate himself against. What I did not know, what I could not have predicted because Victor kept it secret even from his own people, was that Sophia was there that night, had gone to see him one final time, to tell him in person that she was with me permanently, and he needed to accept reality and move on with his life. Because his pursuit of her had crossed every possible boundary and become something genuinely frightening that she could no longer tolerate or excuse as misguided romantic persistence. The words land like physical blows, and suddenly I am seeing the night my mother ran from both of them in horrifying clarity, the fire erupting while she was inside trying to do the right thing and end Victor's obsession humanely, the smoke and flames and desperate escape that left her traumatized enough to disappear completely, rather than stay with either man who had contributed to the nightmare her life had become. Dominic stands up from the table and walks to the window overlooking his manicured grounds, and when he speaks again, his voice carries the weight of guilt that has clearly haunted him through every day since that terrible night. She barely made it out, Celeste, barely survived because Victor's security pulled her from the building at the last possible moment, while I watched from my surveillance position thinking I had finally solved the problem of Victor Constantine permanently, he says, and I can hear the self-loathing bleeding through every syllable. Victor survived too, got out through some secondary exit I did not know existed, and by the time I realized what I had done, that I had nearly killed the woman I loved in my attempt to eliminate my rival, Sophia was already gone, had vanished into the night with nothing but the clothes on her back, and the absolute certainty that both of us were too dangerous to be anywhere near her or the child she was carrying. The complete picture finally crystallizes in my mind, and I understand with terrible clarity that my mother did not run just from Victor's obsession but Dominic's capacity for violence that proved he was willing to risk her life to win their competition. And she spent 17 years keeping me away from both of them, because she understood that neither man could separate their feelings for her from their need to possess and control and defeat each other through whatever means necessary. Before I can process this revelation fully, before I can decide how I feel about Dominic's confession and what it means for my trust in him, the sound of breaking glass erupts from somewhere else in the estate, followed immediately by the sharp crack of gunfire that makes my entire body freeze with primal terror. Alessandro bursts through the dining room door with his weapon drawn and blood running down his left arm, from a wound I can only assume came from whatever attack is currently breaching Dominic's supposedly impenetrable defenses, and he shouts something about the perimeter being compromised and needing to get us to the safe room immediately. But before any of us can move toward safety, Victor Constantine himself appears in the doorway, behind Alessandro, like a ghost materializing from my worst nightmares made flesh. He is exactly as he appeared in the photographs, distinguished and terrifying in equal measure, wearing an expensive suit despite having apparently just led an armed assault on a fortified compound, and holding a gun with the casual competence of someone who has used firearms so frequently they have become simply another tool, rather than a weapon, that should inspire hesitation or moral contemplation. "Step away from my daughter, Dominic," Victor says, and his voice is cultured and calm and absolutely terrifying in its complete lack of emotional urgency, despite the violence that must be raging throughout the estate. Alessandro moves to put himself between Victor and me, but the shot that rings out drops Dominic's loyal second-in-command to the floor before I can even scream, and suddenly I am staring at my biological father across a room that smells like gunpowder and fear while the man who was trying to protect me bleeds onto expensive marble, and Dominic's hand slowly moves toward the weapon I know he keeps holstered at the small of his back. "Don't," Victor says, and the single word carries enough menace that Dominic's hand stops its progression toward his gun. And in that frozen moment, I understand that I have run out of time and options and the luxury of trying to understand my situation before being forced to make choices that will define everything that comes after. Victor's eyes meet mine across the carnage, and in them I see the same violet rings that I have seen in mirrors my entire life. And when he extends his hand toward me in invitation or command, I realize this is the moment my mother must have dreaded every single day of her life, in hiding. The moment when Victor Constantine finally found his daughter and expected her to come to him willingly, because biology somehow trumps the fact that I watched him shoot a man who was trying to protect me. "Come with me, Celeste, and I will keep you safe from all of this," Victor says, gesturing vaguely at Dominic and the chaos outside the dining room, where I can still hear gunfire and shouting and the sounds of his people systematically taking control of an estate that was supposed to be my sanctuary. Dominic is bleeding from a wound in his side that I did not even see happen, slumped against the window with one hand pressed to the spreading red stain on his white shirt. And when his eyes meet mine, they carry a desperation that has nothing to do with his own survival and everything to do with trying to communicate something essential in the few seconds we might have left before Victor loses patience with this tableau we have created. "He'll cage you," Dominic manages to say through obvious pain, and each word sounds like it costs him something vital. "Love and possession are the same thing to him, Celeste. And if you go with him now, you will spend the rest of your life being shaped into whatever he needs you to be, rather than discovering who you actually are without either of us trying to control your choices." But I am 17 years old and terrified and bleeding from where broken glass cut my arm during the initial breach. And when Victor steps closer with his hand still extended, and his expression softening into something that might be genuine paternal concern, if I did not know about the letters and the obsession and the 17 years he spent hunting my mother, I find myself taking his hand, because in this moment, survival trumps ideology, and Victor is offering me a way out of this nightmare, even if that way leads directly into a different nightmare that I cannot fully predict or prepare for. Dominic's expression crumbles into something that looks like grief mixed with resignation as I allow my biological father to lead me out of the dining room and through hallways littered with unconscious or dead guards, whose faces I recognize from 3 days of seeing them patrol the grounds, and I do not look back, because if I look back, I might see something in Dominic's eyes that will make me reconsider this terrible choice I am making with a gun pointed at my spine, and no other options presenting themselves in the chaos of the moment. Victor's estate exists in a completely different world from Dominic's fortress. All old European elegance and antique furniture and oil paintings in gilded frames that probably cost more than most people earn in their entire lifetimes. And for the first 3 days, he treats me like I am made of spun glass that might shatter if handled too roughly, giving me space and time to adjust to my new circumstances, while his private doctors treat the minor injuries I sustained during the assault, and his staff brings me meals I cannot eat, and clothing in exactly my size that he must have prepared weeks ago in anticipation of this moment, when he finally acquired his long-sought daughter. He does not lock my bedroom door or post guards directly outside, but I quickly discover that every exit from this beautiful prison is monitored by security systems that make Dominic's setup look primitive in comparison. And the few times I attempt to test the boundaries of my new cage, I find polite but immovable staff members redirecting me back toward approved areas with smiles that never reach their eyes, and explanations about safety protocols that sound reasonable until you realize they are simply elegant ways of saying, "I am not permitted to leave under any circumstances." The conversations we have during these first days are carefully choreographed performances, where Victor plays the role of concerned father, trying to build a relationship with the daughter he was unjustly denied, sharing memories of my mother that are probably genuine even though they come wrapped in his disturbing obsession, showing me photographs from his own childhood in Moscow, and explaining the history of the Constantine family, with its centuries of tradition and power and influence that he clearly expects me to embrace as my heritage now that I know where I come from. He is charming when he wants to be, cultured and intelligent, and capable of discussing literature and art and philosophy with the ease of someone who has spent a lifetime cultivating sophistication as armor against anyone who might dismiss him as simply a brutal criminal. And I find myself almost forgetting during these conversations that this is the man who shot Alessandro without hesitation, and who has spent 17 years searching for me not because he loves me, but because I represent something he believes belongs to him by right of biology and conquest. The illusion of safety shatters on the fourth night when Victor invites me to join him for dinner in his formal dining room. And when I arrive, dressed in one of the expensive outfits his staff has provided, I find we are not alone, but rather joined by a young man, perhaps 5 years older than me, with dark hair and cold eyes, who Victor introduces as Maxim Orlov, the son of his chief enforcer, and apparently someone I am expected to know, or at least understand the significance of, in the context of whatever plans Victor has been constructing for my future. Maxim looks at me with an expression that makes my skin crawl, something between appraisal and possession. And when Victor explains with obvious satisfaction that Maxim and I will be married on my 18th birthday, in a ceremony that will unite two powerful families and secure the Constantine dynasty for another generation, I feel something inside me go very cold and still, as I finally understand exactly what kind of future my biological father has planned for the daughter he supposedly loves. "You cannot be serious," I say, and my voice sounds distant to my own ears, as if I am listening to someone else speak these words, while I float somewhere above this nightmare watching it unfold with detached horror. "You expect me to marry a stranger, to just accept that you have the right to arrange my entire life like I am some kind of medieval princess in a transaction designed to benefit your criminal empire, and you think I will go along with this because we share DNA, and you have convinced yourself that makes you entitled to control every aspect of my existence?" Victor's expression does not change, but something shifts in his eyes that reminds me he is not actually the sophisticated gentleman he has been pretending to be for the past 4 days, but rather a man who has built his power on violence and intimidation and the absolute conviction that his will should be law for everyone in his sphere of influence. "You are my daughter, you carry my blood, and that means you have responsibilities to the family and the legacy I have spent my entire life building and protecting," he says, in a tone that suggests he is explaining something obvious to a child who should already understand these fundamental truths. Maxime is from excellent stock. His father has served me loyally for 20 years, and together you will produce the grandchildren who will carry the Constantine name into the future, while you learn everything you need to know about running the various enterprises that will eventually be yours to manage alongside your husband. The word husband sounds like a death sentence, and I push back from the table hard enough that my chair scrapes loudly against the floor. But before I can stand up or articulate the fury building in my chest, Maxim reaches across the space between us and grabs my wrist with enough force that I know there will be bruises tomorrow. And the casual way he restrains me while looking to Victor for approval tells me everything I need to know about what my life will be like if I do not find a way out of this situation immediately. "You need to understand your place, Celeste," Victor continues, as if I have not just been physically restrained by my supposed future husband. "I have given you everything: safety from Dominic's manipulation, connection to your true heritage, a future secured by alliance and power. And in return I expect obedience and gratitude and the understanding that you are not here to make choices about your own life, but rather to fulfill the destiny I have prepared for you, since the moment I learned of your existence." The complete horror of my situation finally crystallizes with perfect clarity. I am not Victor's daughter in any meaningful sense, but rather his project, his breeding stock, his living trophy that proves he won against Dominic even if it took 17 years, and my mother's death to finally claim his prize. And every gentle word and every careful courtesy of the past 4 days has been nothing more than manipulation, designed to make me compliant before revealing the cage he has been constructing around my future. I yank my wrist free from Maxim's grip and back toward the Dauquer. And when Victor stands up from his seat with his hand moving toward the gun I now know he carries constantly, I realize with sick certainty that he will not let me leave this room, or this estate, or this life he has planned, unless I find some way to communicate with the outside world and beg for rescue from the man I abandoned 4 days ago, when survival seemed more important than loyalty. The next hours blur together as I am escorted back to my room by staff members who are no longer pretending I am a guest rather than a prisoner. And I pace the elegant space like a caged animal while my mind races through possibilities that all seem equally hopeless, because I have no phone and no internet access, and no way to contact anyone who might care enough to mount a rescue operation for a girl stupid enough to trust her biological father's promises over the warnings of the man who actually loved my mother enough to feel guilty about nearly killing her. But my mother was clever, taught me to be resourceful and observant, and to always have a backup plan even when situations seem completely controlled by forces outside my power. And as the hours stretch toward dawn, I remember the small digital camera I noticed in my room's elaborate entertainment system, probably connected to Victor's security network, but possibly, just possibly, accessible from the inside if I can figure out how to reverse the signal and turn a surveillance device into a communication tool. It takes me until the sun rises to hack into the camera's firmware using techniques my mother taught me years ago for reasons I understand better now. And when I finally manage to send out a single text message to an email address I memorized from Dominic's private files, it reads simply, "You were right. Please come." The response comes 3 hours later in the form of distant explosions that make the entire estate shudder. And when I look out my window, I see Dominic's forces surrounding Victor's property in a coordinated assault that makes his attack on the fortress look amateurish in comparison. And I understand that whatever happens next will end with either my rescue or my death, because men like Dominic Volkov and Victor Constantine do not do anything by halves when they decide to wage war against each other. The sound of gunfire grows closer, and I back away from my bedroom door expecting Victor to appear at any moment with his gun and his rage at my betrayal. But when the door finally crashes open, it is not my biological father, but rather Victor himself, looking less composed than I have ever seen him, with blood on his expensive suit, and his silver-streaked hair disheveled from whatever violence is consuming his carefully ordered world. He does not point his gun at me immediately, but instead walks to the window and looks out at the forces arrayed against him. And when he finally turns to face me, his expression carries something I did not expect to see: genuine sadness mixed with the resignation of someone who has just realized they have lost something they can never reclaim. "If I cannot have you as my daughter, then no one will," he says, and the gun in his hand finally rises to point not at me, but at the window where Dominic's people are visible advancing through smoke and chaos. And I realize with absolute horror that his love for me, if that is even the right word for his pathological need to possess and control, is not salvation or protection, but rather damnation disguised as devotion. The kind of twisted affection that would rather destroy what it claims to cherish than see it belong to anyone else or exist independently, beyond the cage of expectation and obligation. I stand at my window watching the war unfold around me while Victor breathes heavily behind me with his finger on the trigger of a weapon that could end this entire nightmare with a single bullet. And in this moment, I understand with devastating clarity that between these two men who claimed to want what was best for me, I was never actually a person with agency and desires and rights to self-determination, but rather just the ghost of Sophia Marino, the woman they both destroyed with their competing obsessions and their absolute inability to see love as anything other than ownership and control, and the eternal competition to prove which of them deserved to possess what they wanted, regardless of the cost, to everyone caught in the crossfire of their mutual destruction. And I realized too late that my mother's greatest gift to me was not the 17 years of life she gave me before Victor's people arranged her murder, but rather the example she set of a woman brave enough to walk away from both men who claimed to love her and choose freedom over security, even though freedom meant spending the rest of her life running from the consequences of having been loved by monsters who could not understand the difference between devotion and destruction.